turn in your Bibles to John chapter number 13. John, the 13th chapter. We'll be a little short tonight. We're going to take care of a few things afterwards, so be patient with me. And I hope you brought your nimble fingers, maybe some of that sticky tack. We're going to have a sword drill tonight. We're going to go to a lot of different scriptures. Y'all ready for this? All right. John chapter number 13 is a very specific command from the Lord. As you can see in verse number 34, Jesus here is speaking, and he is speaking to a group of men that are gathered, primarily to Peter, but he's speaking to a group of believers that he's teaching very specifically. And in John chapter 13, verse 34, Jesus speaks and he says, "A new commandment I give unto you, that you love one another, as I have loved you, that ye also love one another." Just want to point out a couple of things here. And I titled this devotion, if you will, Family Matters. And these words are spoken here to this group of people. And when Jesus says, "This new commandment I give to you, love one another as I have loved you," that's a goal, but it's an impossible goal to reach, isn't it? That little word "as" has so much meaning. That word "as" is not only a quantitative measure, but it's a qualitative measure. So you're supposed to love one another with the same measure, the same type of love that Jesus loved us. We're commanded, husbands, to love your wives as Christ loved the church. But he says also, to the same extent, he says, "Greater love has no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends," which is what Christ did. So that little tiny word "as," think of it as both qualitative and quantitative. It is both the type of love and the extent of love. These words that are spoken to what would later become the group of men that are collected into the church that Jesus would build here during his earthly ministry, the group of men that he would commission to be apostles, to then bring the gospel to all the families of the world. He says, "This is the new commandment. Y'all love each other." A new commandment, love one another as I have loved you. And then we go to verse number 35, and he gives us the context. He gives us the reason for this commandment. He says, "By this," by what? By this, by the love that you have for one another. He said, "By this shall all men know that you're my disciples, if you have love one to another." By this love that you possess, by this demonstration of love one towards another, all men will understand, all men will know that you are my disciples. It was in reference to this verse that one theologian explained, the unity of the brethren was the greatest tool we had for evangelism. The unity of the brethren is the greatest tool that we possess for evangelism, because as the world sinks in this downward spiral, as we studied on Sunday, of confusion and error and continual debauchery, the world looks at the saints and they see peace, they see unity, they see the love, and they think partisanship in the world. But as James said, first, purity amongst the saints. This author said that unity was the best tool we had for evangelism, but he went on to state that dissension in the church breeds atheism in the world. And he was basically saying the exact opposite of that. Not only does the unity of the church promote the acceptance of Christ by those that are looking outside in, but he says when the lost world looks at the church and sees bickering and quarreling. As James said on Sunday, the envy and the strife. They say, we don't want no part of that. If God's own children can't get along, why would I want to be adopted into that family? Turn just a few pages, if you will, from John 13 to John chapter number 15. We'll pick up at verse number 11. And again, Jesus is speaking. He said, these things have I spoken unto you, that my joy might remain in you, and that your joy might be full. And then he repeats himself, just to make sure that you picked up both statements from chapter 13. John records Christ's words again here in chapter 15. He says, I've spoken this to you that my joy would remain in you and that your joy would be full. He says in verse 12, this is my commandment, that you love one another as, there's that word again, as I have loved you. Greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends. You are my friends if you do whatsoever I command you. Henceforth I call you not servants. For the servant knoweth not what his Lord doeth, but I have called you friends. For all things that I have heard of my Father I have made known to you. You've not chosen me, but I have chosen you and ordained you that you should go and bring forth fruit. That's what we said Sunday, right? First pure, then all of the peaceable fruit that James laid out for us that we studied on Sunday. And he says, and that your fruit should remain. Remember the peaceful fruit that is sown in peace. And whatsoever you shall ask of the Father in my name, he may give it you. These things I commend you, that you love one another. And so Jesus here, as we've said before in our study through James, James so often echoes the teachings of Christ. And Jesus here explains that our realization of joy, our recognition of the joy that he possesses and that he gives to us as his saints, is directly correlated to our love that we have and to the love that we express one towards another. Those commands are not isolated. The 12 apostles, the men that he was speaking to, comprehended and they absorbed these teachings into their very own lives. That's what we've been studying in the book of James. That's where this thought for this message came from. It was Peter that strengthened the brethren. It was Barnabas that is called the son of consolation. It is Paul, the great missionary author, that repeated these words, love one another, so consistently throughout his epistles. The New Testament letters to the various churches, to the young pastors, are loaded with the commands to serve one another, to love one another. If you're a Greek scholar, you can search one word, the word allelon, and you can find that there are nearly 60 commands to love one another in the New Testament. Romans chapter number 12, if you'll go there with me. Romans chapter number 12, the Apostle Paul, speaking to the church in Rome, verse number 9, he says, let love be without dissimulation. Abhor that evil, cleave to that which is good. But here's the commandment in verse number 10. He says, be kindly affectioned one to another with brotherly love, in honor preferring one another. These are all the one another commands. And so for a brief time tonight, I'd like to just look at the positive one another commands. And we can't look at all 60 of them, so I'd like to just narrow the list down to the ones that say love one another. The first of the multiple one another commands of the Pauline letters is here in Romans chapter 12. It's a positive one another command. I want you to remember that the mystery of the church, Paul said, is best demonstrated as a body. It is the body of Christ. Paul refers to this body as a marriage between two believers, one man and one woman that is united in both a dedication and covenant to one another. And then he says, we as a body, as a covenant community, are to exhibit that family behavior in this body. And we are dedicated to Christ. the New Testament epistles demonstrate this loving one another concept, this brotherly love, as Paul says here, in honor, preferring one another. It occurs at least 10 times, and so we'll only look at these loving one another command. The first one here in Romans chapter 12, Paul says, kind affections one to another. One another. You see that there? We'll not dwell on these. They're straightforward. We're to have kind affections. That's another term for love. Across the page in my Bible to chapter 13, verse number 8, he says, owe no man anything but to love one another. For he that loveth another hath fulfilled the law. And so in our love is the fulfillment of the law. He that loveth one another. We go a few pages to 1 Thessalonians. You don't have to look at all of these. Your pages stick together like mine. I've got them all printed in my notes. So, my pages stick together. There we go, right there. 1 Thessalonians chapter 3, verse number 12. The Lord make you increase and abound in love, one toward another, and toward all men, even as we do toward you. Abound in love. Again, on the next page in chapter 4, verse number 9. As touching brotherly love, you need not that I write unto you, for ye yourselves are taught of God to love one another. And so this love that we have one for another is a blessing from God. It is one of the gifts that comes from God. It is one of the gifts that comes down, as James says, from the Father of lights. It is a gift of God's grace. It is a blessing that we have in a covenant community. We're thankful for our wives. We're thankful for our children and our grandchildren. And we're thankful for our friends. We're thankful for this covenant community. We are taught by God. We're taught of God to love one another. Paul goes on a few more pages hence in 2 Thessalonians, the book, the letter to the Thessalonians, the second letter in chapter number 1. Verse 3, he says, we're bound to thank God always for you, brethren, as it is meet, because that your faith groweth exceedingly, and the charity, the love, of every one of you all toward each other aboundeth. It's overabounding. He's basically saying there that we're thankful because not only is your faith growing, but your love that you have towards each other is abounding. It's growing as well as your faith. As your faith grows, your care of the saints grows. As your faith is increased, as the love that you have for God's word and the trust that you have for God increases, your love and your care of your fellow saints increases as well. We'll move on. 1 Peter. We'll move away from the Pauline epistles, and we'll look at Peter. 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 22. He says, seeing ye have purified your souls, or because you have purified your souls, in obeying the truth through the Spirit, unto unfeigned love of the brethren, see that you love one another with a pure heart, fervently. And that fervently means with great heat. since you have purified your souls through obeying the truth, and this comes through the Spirit. So in other words, there's a component of love that comes from God. It's all originated with God, but it also comes through the work of the Spirit. Since you have purified your souls, since you have obeyed the truth, since you're obedient to the Spirit, to unfeigned love. In other words, the love that we possess for each other is not made up. It's not artificial. It's not showy. It's not just put on. It's not window dressing. It's real. Remember that it was the first church that you can read in the early chapters of Acts. They went and they held all things common. Some sold land, some sold property to care for and to provide for others that were needy and had dire wants. He says, see that you love one another with a pure heart. John echoes the same thing, and not only in his gospel that we've already read, but in his letters in 1 John chapter 3, verse 11. This is the message that you heard from the beginning. We should love one another. It's not new. So he says this teaching is not new. This teaching is from the very beginning. This teaching is from the beginning of his writings, from the gospel that he wrote. But earlier than that, this was from the beginning of the ministry of Christ himself. But even earlier than that, we can go all the way back to the Old Testament, to the Torah. We can look at the law that was given to Moses. And if you divide the law according to the two tables, you find that the first table of the law is man's relationship to God. The second table of law is man's relationship to his fellow man, which Jesus summarized as love thy neighbor as thyself. The message you heard from the beginning is that you love one another. In the same chapter, in verse number 23, John says, this is his commandment, that we should believe on the name of his Son, Jesus Christ, and love one another as he gave us commandment. What is he doing? He's just repeating what Jesus said that he recorded in his own words in the Gospel of John in chapters 13 and chapter 15 that we've already read. Turn the page to chapter 4, verse number 7. He says, beloved, let us love one another, for love is of God. Everyone that loveth is born of God and knoweth God. Again, that points to the fact that our love for the brethren is again a direct derivative. It's a direct indicator of our love and our relationship with God. Verse number 11, if God so loved us, we ought also to love one another. As I have loved you, is what Christ said. And just to be complete, the letter of 2 John, the letter to the elect lady and her children, in verse number 11, verse 5. Now I beseech thee, lady, not as though I wrote a new commandment unto thee, but that which we had from the beginning, that we love one another. And again, he's pointing to the same commandment, that we love one another. This is love, that we walk after his commandment. This is the commandment that, as you heard from the beginning, we should walk in it. Love one another. And so, as I've said, there's approximately, it depends on how you divide them up, there's about 60 one another commandments in the New Testament. But there are 11 of those one another commandments in the New Testament that talk about loving one another. These one another ministries are to be carried out. They're to be expressed through the church. And they're all pretty self-explanatory. There's not any depth of thought or depth of theology that needs to go behind them. it's important that we love one another. But in order to be complete, let's look at the other side of this as well. There are some negatives. There are some commandments. There are some one another commandments in the New Testament that are also negative commandments. Things that the Scripture tells us to eliminate from our lives. In other words, we must avoid what the Word tells us to remove. Those commandments are very similar. They also say one another, but they're generally recognized by the words do not, or there's a negative particle, not or no, along with them. I categorize these for you very quickly. If you're taking notes, you can write them down. You don't have to turn to all of these. Again, back in the Pauline letters in Romans chapter 13, we talk about debt. Romans 13, verse number 8, Paul says, owe no man anything but to love one another. And he that loveth another hath fulfilled the law. So, I mean, even the debt goes back to loving one another, doesn't it? It says, don't be in debt, but love one another. It's amazing how it just works into everything, doesn't it? The second one we find, again, just on in my Bible, on the very next page, in the very next chapter, in chapter 14, he talks about determination. Another word for judgment. Let us not, therefore, judge one another. So don't judge one another anymore, but judge this rather, that no man put a stumbling block or occasion to fall in his brother's way. Don't be an obstacle to your brother. Why? Because that's not loving. Do not judge one another. We'll move to his letter to the Corinthians, his 1 Corinthians. And I understand this is very topical and it's very much like a sword drill, but I hope it comes together in a full context. After debt and determination or judgment, he says deprivation. 1 Corinthians chapter number 7. We'll not read all of this, but look straight to verse number 5. Deprivation, or another word, is defraud. Defraud ye not one another. One the other. That's how it says here. Defraud ye not one the other, except to be with consent for time, that ye may give yourselves to fasting and prayer, and come together again, that Satan tempt you not. So there's deprivation. Don't do that. Galatians chapter 5. Moving on in the Pauline letters. He speaks to the Galatians. Well, this will be important again on Sunday, so I'm tying last Sunday to next Sunday, and you'll see why. We'll tie all this up in a pretty bow Sunday morning, I hope. Galatians chapter number 5. Devouring. Don't be in debt. Don't make determinations. Don't deprive. Don't devour. If you bite and devour one another, take heed that you be not consumed one of another. Don't devour. Don't bite and devour one another. Go straight down to verse 26 of the same chapter. He says, let us not be desirous of vainglory, provoking one another, envying one another. And this is defying one another. He says, let us not be desirous of vainglory. He uses the verb here, provoking one another. And this word to provoke means to challenge someone into combat. It's to call forth someone into battle. It's the idea that goes that you pick at someone until they just can't take it anymore. And they strike out and they lash out at you. It's the thought of Goliath coming down a hill and challenging, provoking, irritating, calling forth to battle the Israelites. He says, don't provoke one another. Don't just keep needling at that one. Don't pick the scab, is what he's saying. Just leave it alone. That ties directly to what we said last Sunday. And he goes on in this verse. It's not like he's picking a scab. He's closing the wound. He says, let us not be desiring vainglory, provoking one another, and envying one another. Same word that James has been talking about. Envying one another. I just couldn't find a D for my alliteration. Devouring and defying. I couldn't find a D word for envy. If you know one, you can give it to me later. I just couldn't find one that expressed the animosity of envy. You know the difference between jealousy and envy? Jealousy says, you know, that chocolate cake you've got, I sure wish I had one. It really looks good. Envy says, since I can't have one, I hope you choke on it and die. That's the difference between jealousy and envy. He says, don't be that way. Let's move on. Colossians chapter number 3. The letter to the Colossians. And you notice that every one of these churches has problems? And nobody here is exempt. To the Colossians in chapter 3, verse number 9, we see deceit. What does he say here? He says, lie not one to another, seeing that ye have put off the old man with his deeds. So stop the deceit. Stop lying one to another. Now we leave the letters to the churches and look at the letters that he wrote to the young pastors. And in Titus chapter 3, verse number 3, we see that the saints are detesting one another. Chapter 3, verse 3 of Titus, he says, for we ourselves also were sometimes foolish, disobedient, deceived, serving diverse lusts and pleasures, living in malice and envy, hateful and hating one another. That's where I get the word detesting. He says, don't be hating one another. Don't lie to each other with deceit. Don't detest one another. And it gets worse. Let's just go on over to our text that we've been studying through, the letter of James. James chapter 4. We see debate. Verse number 11. Speak not evil one of another. Speak not evil one of another, brethren. Oh, you mean there are brethren that can speak evil of each other? Well, that's what he told us in chapter 3 that we studied a couple weeks ago. Speak not evil one of another, brethren. He that speaketh evil of his brother and judges his brother speaketh evil of the law and judges the law. But if thou judge the law, thou art not a doer of the law, but a judge. This is debating. We'll not delve into this too deeply because this is square in the middle of our text for Sunday morning. But let's just move on and show you that he's going to hit it again. In chapter 5, in verse 9, he says, grudge not. That's dislike. You know, you might look at all of these things and say, okay, well, if I'm not supposed to do this and I'm not supposed to do that, and the word forbids all of these negative actions, well, the word also forbids carrying a grudge. Grudge not one another, brethren, lest ye be condemned. Behold, the judge standeth before the door, and he says, don't grudge. Don't hold a grudge one against another. So dislike is forbidden too. I just don't like you anymore. Okay, I won't debate. I won't spread gossip. I won't spread false news. I won't devour. I won't envy. I won't deceive. I'm just not going to like you anymore. Well, guess what? Love one another. Preferring one another means you don't dislike them either. You love one another fervently. Unfeigned love. This struck me this week as I was dealing with some things in my own family, as I was contemplating some things at work and studying last week and studying ahead for this coming week. Wow, do we have commands to be careful to love one another. We have to put off all these things, all of these negative attributes from our Christian walk. We're commanded to love out of a pure heart, to love to the extent that Christ loves, and to not be any of these negative characters, any of these negative attributes. You know how difficult that is? I mean, it's difficult not even to do that to your spouse. I mean, sometimes you get up and you have a crossword with your spouse and you say, all right, just leave me alone for a while. That's not in honor of preferring one another, is it? Have you ever heard, well, I love you, but I just don't like you today? That's not scriptural, is it? And so we debate. Well, I'll get on Facebook, or I'll get on the phone, or I'll get on the text, and I'll speak not evil one of another. Don't be defying. Don't be devouring. You know, all of these other things. And that just hit me as I was thinking about the things that I'm dealing with in my life, and I think I'm dealing with at work, and things with my family. And honestly, the things that we've been praying about and dealing with. And I just pray the Lord would help us to be more conscious of unity and love and being kindly affectioned, that we may abound in love one towards another. I know this is a break from our normal Wednesday night, but this impressed upon me and I had to share it with y'all. So let's stand. We'll have a song. We'll have a word of prayer. I have some other announcements.